This is Audible.
Silent Scream. Detective Kim Stone Crime Thriller Series, Volume 1. Written by Angela Marsons. Narrated by Jan Kramer. Prologue. Rowley Regis, Black Country, 2004. 5 figures formed a pentagram around a freshly dug mound. Only they knew it was a grave. Digging the frozen earth beneath the layers of ice and snow had been like trying to carve stone, but they'd taken turns, all of them. An adult-sized hole would have taken longer. The shovel had passed from grip to grip. Some were hesitant, tentative, others more assured. No one resisted, and no one spoke. The innocence of the life taken was known to them all, but the pact had been made. Their secrets would be buried. 5 heads bowed towards the dirt, visualizing the body beneath soil that already glistened with fresh ice. As the first flakes dusted the top of the grave, a shudder threaded through the group. The 5 figures dispersed, their footprints treading the trail of a star into the fresh, crisp snow. It was done. Chapter 1. Black Country, Present Day. Teresa Wyatt had the inexplicable feeling that this night would be her last. She switched off the television and the house fell quiet. It wasn't the normal silence that descended each evening as she and her home gently closed down and unwound towards bedtime. She wasn't sure what she'd been expecting on the late-night news. The announcement had already been made on the local evening news programme. Perhaps she was hoping for a miracle, some last-minute reprieve. Ever since the first application 2 years ago, she had felt like a prisoner on death row. Intermittently the guards had come, taken her to the chair, and then fate had returned her to the safety of the cell. But this time was final. Teresa knew there would be no further objections, no more delays. She wondered if the others had seen the news. Did they feel the same way she did? Would they admit to themselves that their primary feelings were not remorse, but self-preservation? Had she been a nicer person, there might have been a smattering of conscience buried beneath her concern for herself. But there was not. Had she not gone along with the plan, she would have been ruined, she told herself. The name Teresa Wyatt would have been mentioned with distaste, instead of the respect she now enjoyed. Teresa had no doubt that the complaint would have been taken seriously. The source had been devious but believable, but it had been silenced forever, and that was something she would never regret. But now and again, in the years since Crestwood, her stomach had lurched at the sight of a similar gait or a hair colour or a tilt of the head. Teresa stood and tried to throw off the melancholy that shadowed her. She strode to the kitchen and put the single plate and wine glass into the dishwasher. There was no dog to let out or cat to let in, just the final nighttime security check of the deadbolts. Again she was struck by a feeling that the safety check was pointless, that nothing could hold back the past. She pushed the thought away. There was nothing to fear. They all had made a pact, and it had held strong for 10 years. Only the 5 of them knew the truth. She knew she was too tense to drift off to sleep immediately, but she had called a 7 a.m. staff meeting for which she could not be late. She stepped into the bathroom and began to run the water, adding a generous measure of lavender-infused bubble bath. The scent instantly filled the room. A long soak on top of the earlier glass of wine should induce sleep. The dressing gown and satin pyjamas were folded neatly on top of the laundry basket as she stepped into the tub. She closed her eyes and surrendered to the water as it enveloped her. She smiled to herself as the anxiety began to recede. She was just being hypersensitive. Teresa felt that her life had been divided into 2 segments. There were 37 years BC, as she called her life before Crestwood. Those years had been charmed, single and ambitious. Every decision had been her own. She had answered to no one. But the years since had been different. A shadow of fear had followed her every move, dictated her actions, influenced her decisions. She remembered reading somewhere that conscience was no more than the fear of being caught. Teresa was honest enough to admit that for her the statement was true. But their secret was safe. It had to be. Suddenly she heard the sound of a glass panel shattering, but the sound was not in the distance. It was at her kitchen door. Teresa lay perfectly still, her ears straining for further sounds. The noise would not have alerted anyone else. The next detached home sat 200 feet away, on the other side of a Leylandii hedge that rose 20 feet high. The silence of her house thickened around her. The quiet that followed the loud noise was fraught with menace. Perhaps it was nothing more than a mindless act of vandalism. Maybe a couple of the students from St. Joseph's had learned her address. By God, she hoped so. The blood thundered along her veins, vibrating into her temples. She swallowed in an attempt to clear her eardrums. Her body began to react to the sensation that she was no longer alone. She brought herself to a sitting position. The sound of the water rearranging itself was loud as it sloshed against the tub. Her hand slipped on the porcelain and her right side fell back into the water. A sound at the bottom of the stairs destroyed any vague hope of mindless vandalism. Teresa knew that she was out of time. In a parallel universe, the muscles in her body reacted to the impending threat, but in this one both her body and her mind were stilled by the inevitable. She knew that there was nowhere left to hide. As she heard the creak of the stairs, she briefly closed her eyes and willed her body to stay calm. There was an element of freedom when finally confronted by the fears that haunted her. As she felt the cool air enter the room from the doorway, she opened her eyes. The figure that entered was as black and featureless as a shadow. Utility trousers met a thick black fleece which was covered by a long overcoat. A woolen balaclava covered the face. But why me? Teresa's mind raged. She was not the weakest link. She shook her head. "I haven't spoken," she said. The words were barely audible. Every one of her senses was beginning to close down as her body prepared for death. The black figure took 2 steps towards her. Teresa searched for a clue but found none. It could only be one of 4. Teresa felt the betrayal of her body as urine slipped from between her legs into the scented water. "I promise, I haven't—" Teresa's words trailed away as she tried to lift herself to a sitting position. The bath bubbles had turned the tub slippery. Her breath came in short, sharp rasps as she considered how best to beg for her life. No, she didn't want to die. It wasn't time. She wasn't ready. There were things that she wanted to do. She had the sudden image of water flooding her lungs, inflating them like party balloons. She held out her hand imploringly, finally finding her voice. "Please, please, no. I don't want to die." The figure leaned over the bath and placed a gloved hand above each breast. Teresa felt the pressure being applied to force her under the water and struggled to sit up. She had to try and explain, but the force of the hands increased. Again she tried to rear up from her inert position, but it was hopeless. Gravity and brute strength made it impossible for her to fight back. As the water framed her face, she opened her mouth. A small sob escaped from between her lips as she tried one last time. "I swear." The words were cut short, and Teresa watched as the air bubbles escaped from her nose and reached the surface. Her hair swam around her face. The figure shimmered on the other side of the water barrier. Teresa's body began to react to the oxygen deprivation, and she tried to quell the panic rising inside her. Her arms flailed, and the gloved hand was briefly dislodged from her breastbone. She managed to raise her head above the water and got a closer look into the cold, piercing eyes. Recognition sapped the last of her breath. The brief second of confusion was enough for her attacker to reposition. 2 hands forced her body underwater and held her fast. Her mind was full of disbelief, even as her consciousness began to wane. Teresa realized that her co-conspirators could not even imagine who it was they had to fear. Chapter 2. Kim Stone stepped around the Kawasaki Ninja to adjust the volume on her iPod. The speakers danced with the silvery notes of Vivaldi's Summer Concerto as they headed towards her favourite part, the finale called Storm. She placed the socket wrench on the workbench and wiped her hands with a stray rag. She stared at the Triumph Thunderbird she'd been restoring for the past 7 months and wondered why it had not captured her tonight. She glanced at her watch. Almost 11 p.m. The rest of her team would be staggering out of the dog right about now, and although she didn't touch alcohol, she accompanied her team when she felt she'd earned it. She retrieved the socket wrench and lowered herself to the knee pad beside the Triumph. It wasn't a celebration for her. The terrified face of Laura Yates swam before her eyes as she reached inside the guts of the bike and found the rear end of the crankshaft. She placed the socket head over the nut and turned the wrench in a back-and-forth motion. 3 guilty verdicts of rape were going to send Terence Hunt away for a very long time, but not long enough, Kim said to herself, because there had been a 4th victim. She turned the wrench again, but the nut refused to tighten. She'd already assembled the bearing, sprocket, clamping washer and rotor. The nut was the final puzzle piece, and the damn thing refused to tighten against the locking washer. Kim stared at the nut and silently willed it to move for its own sake. Still nothing. She focused her anger on the arm of the socket wrench and gave it one almighty push. The thread broke and the nut turned freely. "Damn it!" she shouted, throwing the wrench across the garage. Laura Yates had trembled in the witness box as she'd recounted the ordeal of being dragged behind a church and repeatedly brutally sexually assaulted for 2.5 hours. They had seen with their own eyes how hard it had been for her to sit down 3 months after the attack. The 19-year-old had sat in the gallery as each guilty verdict was read out. Then it came to her case, and 2 words was stated that would change her life forever. Not guilty. And why? Because the girl had consumed a couple of drinks. Forget the 11 stitches that stretched from back to front, the broken rib and the black eye. She must have asked for it, all because she'd had a couple of bloody drinks. Kim was aware that her hands had started to tremble with rage. Her team felt that 3 out of 4 wasn't bad, and it wasn't, but it wasn't good enough. Not for Kim. She leaned down to inspect the damage to the bike. It had taken almost 6 weeks to track down those bloody screws. She eased the socket into position and turned the wrench again between her thumb and forefinger as her mobile phone began to ring. She dropped the nut and jumped to her feet. A call so close to midnight was never going to be good news. "D.I. Stone, we have a body, ma'am." Of course, what else could it have been? "Where?" "Hagley Road, Stourbridge." Kim knew the area. It was just on the border with their neighbours West Mercia. "Should we put a call into D.S. Bryant, ma'am?" Kim cringed. She hated the term ma'am. At 34, she wasn't ready to be called ma'am. A picture of her colleague stumbling into a taxi outside the dog came into her mind. "No, I think I'll take this on my own," she said, ending the call. Kim paused for 2 seconds as she silenced the iPod. She knew she had to let go of the accusations she'd seen in the eyes of Laura Yates, but she couldn't get it out of her mind. She would always know that the justice in which she believed had failed someone it was designed to protect. She had persuaded Laura Yates to trust in both her and the system she represented, and Kim couldn't rid herself of the feeling that Laura had been let down. By both of them. Chapter 3. 4 minutes after receiving the phone call, Kim was pulling off the drive in the 10-year-old Golf GTI that she used only when the roads were icy or when the firing of the Ninja would be an antisocial act. The torn jeans stained with oil, grease and dust had been replaced by black canvas trousers and a plain white t-shirt. Her feet were now encased in black patent boots with a 1/4-inch heel. Her short black hair required little maintenance. A quick comb from her fingers and she was ready to go. Her customer would not be concerned. She weaved the car to the end of the road. The machine felt alien within her control. Although it was only small, Kim had to concentrate on passing distances of parked cars. So much metal around her felt cumbersome. A mile away from the target property, the smell of burning found its way in through the vents. As she travelled, the smell became stronger. 1/2 mile out, She could see a column of smoke leaning and reaching above the Clent Hills, a quarter-mile, and Kim knew she was heading right for it. Second only in size to the Met, the West Midlands Police covered almost 2.6 million inhabitants. The Black Country was situated to the north and west of Birmingham and had become one of the most intensely industrialised regions in the country by Victorian times. Its name came from the outcropping coal that made the soil black over large areas. The 30-foot seam of ore and coal was the thickest in Great Britain. Now unemployment levels in the area were the third highest in the country. Petty crime was on the increase, along with antisocial behaviour. The crime scene sat just off the main road that linked Stourbridge to Hagley, an area that did not normally attract high levels of law-breaking. The houses closest to the road were new double-fronted properties with sparkling white Roman columns and black leaded windows. Further along the road, the houses were spread further apart and were considerably older. Kim pulled up at the cordon and parked between two fire tenders. Without speaking, she flashed her ID to the officer guarding the perimeter tape. He nodded and lifted it for her to duck underneath. "What happened?" she asked the first fire officer she found. He pointed to the remains of the first conifer tree at the edge of the property. "Fire was started there and spread through most of the trees before we got here." Kim noted that of the 13 trees that formed the property line, only the two closest to the house were untouched. "You discovered the body?" He pointed to a fire officer sitting on the ground, talking to a constable. "Just about everyone else was out watching the commotion, but this house stayed dark. Neighbours assured us that the black Range Rover was hers and that she lived alone." Kim nodded and approached the fire officer on the ground. He looked pale, and she noted a slight tremble to his right hand. Finding a dead body was never pleasant, no matter what training you'd had. "Did you touch anything?" she asked. He thought for a second and then shook his head. "The bathroom door was open, but I didn't step inside." Kim paused at the front door, reached into the cardboard box to the left, and took out blue plastic coverings for her feet. Kim took the stairs 2 at a time and entered the bathroom. She immediately located Keats, the pathologist. He was a diminutive figure with a completely bald head, set off by a moustache and a beard that fell into a point below his chin. He'd had the honour of guiding her through her first post-mortem 8 years earlier. "Hey, detective," he said, looking around her. "Where's Bryant?" "Jesus, we're not joined at the hip." "Yeah, but you're like a Chinese dish. Sweet and sour pork, but without Bryant you're just sour. Keats, how amused do you think I am at this time of night? Your sense of humour isn't really evident any time, to be fair." Oh, how she wanted to retaliate. If she wished to, she could comment on the fact that the creases in his black trousers were not quite straight, or she could point out that the collar of his shirt was slightly frayed. She could even mention the small bloodstain on the back of his coat. But right now, a naked body lay between them, demanding her full attention. Kim moved closer to the bath slowly, careful not to slip on the water that was being sloshed around by 2 white suits. The body of the female lay partly submerged. Her eyes were open, and her dyed blonde hair was fanned out in the water, framing her face. Her body floated, so that the tip of her breasts broke the surface of the water. Kim guessed the female to be mid to late 40s, but well kept. Her upper arms appeared toned, but limp flesh hung in the water. Her toenails were painted a soft pink, and no stubble showed on her legs. The volume of the water on the floor indicated that a struggle had taken place, and that the woman had fought for her life. Kim heard footsteps thundering up the stairs. "Detective Inspector Stone, a pleasant surprise." Kim groaned, recognising the voice and the sarcasm dripping from the words. "Detective Inspector Wharton, the pleasure is all mine." The two of them had worked together a few times, and her disdain had never been hidden. He was a career officer who wanted to climb the ladder as quickly as possible. He had no interest in solving cases, only adding to his tally. His final humiliation had been when she'd made DI before he had. Her early promotion had prompted him to move house and transfer to West Mercia, a smaller force with less competition. "What are you doing here? I think you'll find this is a West Mercia case." "And I think you'll find it's right on the border and I got first dibs." Unconsciously, she'd stepped in front of the bath. The victim didn't need any more curious eyes roving over her naked body. "It's my case, Stone." Kim shook her head and folded her arms. "I ain't budging, Tom." She tipped her head. "We could always make this a joint investigation. I was here first, so I'll lead." His thin, mean face filled with colour. Reporting to her would only be done after gouging out his own eyeballs with a rusty spoon. She assessed him from head to toe. "And my first instruction would be to enter the crime scene with appropriate protection." He looked down at his feet and then at his own unprotected footwear. More haste, less speed, she thought to herself. She lowered her voice. "Don't make this a pissing contest, Tom." He gave her a look filled with contempt before turning and storming out of the bathroom. Kim turned her attention back to the body. "You'd have won," Keats said quietly. "Huh?" His eyes danced with amusement. "The pissing contest." Kim nodded. She knew. "Can we get her out of here yet?" Just a couple more close-ups of her breastbone. As he spoke, one of the forensic officers pointed a camera with a lens the length of an exhaust pipe at the woman's breasts. Kim leaned in closer and saw 2 marks above each breast. "Push down?" "I'm thinking so. Preliminary exam shows no other injuries. I'll tell you more after the post-mortem." "Any guesses on how long?" Kim could see no evidence of the liver probe, so she was guessing he'd used the rectal thermometer before she'd arrived. She knew that a body dropped temperature by 1.5 degrees centigrade in the first hour. Normally, it was between 1.5 and 1 degree centigrade every hour thereafter. She also knew that figure to be affected by many other factors, not least that the victim was naked and submerged in now cold water. He shrugged. "I'll do further calculations later, but I'd say no more than about 2 hours. When can you—" "I've got a 96-year-old lady who expired after falling asleep in her armchair and a 26-year-old male with the needle still in his arm." "Nothing urgent, then?" He checked his watch. "Midday? 8, she countered. 10 and no earlier," he grumbled. "I'm human and need occasional rest." "Perfect," she said. It was the exact time she had in mind. It would give her a chance to brief her team and task someone to attend. Kim heard more footsteps on the stairs. The sound of laboured breathing came closer. "Sergeant Travis," she said, without turning. "What have we got?" "Officers are canvassing the area. The FOA rounded up a couple of neighbours, but the first thing they knew was the fire service rolling up. Alert call was from a passing motorist." Kim turned and nodded. The first officer attending had done a good job of securing the scene for the forensics team and corralling any potential witnesses, but the houses were set back from the road and separated by a 1/4 acre. Not exactly a mecca for the nosy neighbour. "Go on," she said. "Point of entry was a smashed glass panel in the back door, and the fire officer states that the front door was unlocked." Interesting." She nodded her thanks and headed down the stairs. One technician was inspecting the hallway and another was dusting the back door for fingerprints. A designer handbag sat on the breakfast bar. Kim had no idea what the gold monogram fastener meant. She never used handbags, but it looked expensive. A third tech entered from the dining room next door. He nodded towards the handbag. "Nothing taken. Credit cards and cash still intact." Kim nodded and headed out of the house. At the doorway she removed the shoe coverings and placed them into a second box. All protective clothing would be removed from the scene and examined for trace evidence later. She stepped under the cordon. One fire tender remained on watch to ensure the blaze was totally extinguished. Fire was clever, and just one ember that went unnoticed could set the place ablaze within minutes. She stood at the car, surveying the bigger picture of the scene before her. Teresa Wyatt lived alone. Nothing appeared to have been taken or even disturbed. The killer could have left safe in the knowledge that the body would not be discovered until the following morning at the earliest, and yet they had started a fire to expedite police attention. Now all Kim had to do was work out why. Chapter 4. At 7:30 a.m, Kim parked the Ninja at Halesowen police station just off the ring road that circled a town with a small shopping precinct and a college. The station was located within spitting distance of the magistrate's court, convenient but a bitch for claiming expenses. The 3-storey building was as drab and unwelcoming as any other government building that apologised to tax-paying citizens. She navigated her way to the detective's office without offering any morning greetings, and none were offered to her. Kim knew she had a reputation for being cold, socially inept and emotionless. This perception deflected banal small talk, and that was fine by her. As usual, she was first into the detective's office and so fired up the coffee machine. The room held 4 desks in 2 sets of 2 facing each other. Each desk mirrored its partner with a computer screen and mismatched file trays. 3 of the desks accommodated permanent occupants, but the 4th sat empty since they had been downsized a few months earlier. It was where she normally perched herself rather than in her office. The space with Kim's name on the door was commonly referred to as the bowl. It was nothing more than an area in the top right-hand corner of the room that was partitioned off by plasterboard and glass. It was a space she used for the occasional individual performance directive, otherwise known as a good old-fashioned bollocking. "Morning, Gov," Detective Constable Wood called as she slid into her chair. Although her family background was half English and half Nigerian, Stacey had never set foot outside the United Kingdom. Her tight black hair was cut short and close to her head, following the removal of her last weave. The smooth caramel skin suited the haircut well. Stacey's work area was organised and clear. Anything not in the labelled trays was stacked in meticulous piles along the top edge of her desk. Not far behind was Detective Sergeant Bryant, who mumbled a "Morning, Gov" as he glanced into the bowl. His 6-foot frame looked immaculate, as though he had been dressed for Sunday school by his mother. Immediately the suit jacket landed on the back of his chair. By the end of the day, his tie would have dropped a couple of floors, the top button of his shirt would be open, and his shirt sleeves would be rolled up just below his elbows. She saw him glance at her desk, seeking evidence of a coffee mug. When he saw that she already had coffee, he filled the mug labelled "World's Best Taxi Driver," a present from his 19-year-old daughter. His filing was not a system that anyone else understood, but Kim had yet to request any piece of paper that was not in her hands within a few seconds. At the top of his desk was a framed picture of himself and his wife, taken at their 25th wedding anniversary, a picture of his daughter snuggled in his wallet. DS Kevin Dawson, the 3rd member of her team, didn't keep a photo of anyone special on his desk. Had he wanted to display a picture of the person for whom he felt most affection, he would have been greeted by his own likeness throughout his working day. "Sorry I'm late, Gov," Dawson called as he slid into his seat opposite Wood and completed her team. He wasn't officially late. The shift didn't start until 8 a.m, but she liked them all in early for a briefing, especially at the beginning of a new case. Kim didn't like to stick to a roster, and people who did lasted a very short time on her team. "Hey, Stacey, you going to give me a coffee or what?" Dawson asked, checking his mobile phone. "Of course, Kev. How'd you like it? Milk, 2 sugars and in your lap?" she asked sweetly, in her strong black country accent. "Stace, would you like a coffee?" he asked, rising, knowing full well that she didn't touch the stuff. "You must be tired after fighting warlocks all night," he quipped, referring to Stacey's addiction to the online game World of Warcraft. "Actually, Kev, I received a powerful spell from a high priestess that can turn a grown man into a raging dickhead, but looks like someone else got to you first." Dawson held his stomach and offered mock laughter. "Gov," Bryant called over his shoulder, "the kids are playing up again." He turned back to the 2 of them and wagged a finger. "You 2 just wait until your mother gets home." Kim rolled her eyes and sat at the spare desk, eager to begin. "OK, Bryant, hand out the statements. Kev, get the board." Dawson took the marker pen and stood next to the whiteboard that occupied the entire back wall. While Bryant divided up the paperwork, she talked through the events of earlier that morning. "Our victim is Teresa Wyatt, 47 years old, highly respected principal of a private boys' school in Stourbridge. No marriage or children. Lived comfortably but not lavishly and had no enemies that we're aware of." Kev noted the information as bullet points beneath the heading of victim. Bryant's phone rang. He said little before replacing the receiver and nodding in Kim's direction. "Woody wants you." She ignored him. "Kev, make a second heading, crime." "No murder weapon, no robbery. So far no forensics and no clues." "Next heading, motive. People are normally murdered because of something they have done, something they are doing, or something they are going to do. As far as we know, our victim was not engaged in any kind of dangerous activity. Gov, the DCI wants you." Kim took another gulp of the fresh cuppa. "Trust me, Bryant, he likes me better when I've had coffee. Care for the post-mortem is at 10. Stace, find out everything you can about our victim. Bryant, contact the school and let them know we're coming. Gov!" Kim finished her drink. "Calm down, Mum, I'm going." She took the stairs to the 3rd floor 2 at a time and knocked lightly before entering. DCI Woodward was a heavy-set man in his mid-50s. His mixed-race origins gifted him smooth brown skin that travelled up and over his hairless head. His black trousers and white shirt were crisp and creased in all the right places. The reading glasses on the tip of his nose did little to disguise the tired eyes behind them. He waved her in and pointed to a chair, giving her a full view of the glass cabinet holding his model car collection. The lower shelf housed a selection of classic British models, but the upper shelf displayed a history of police vehicles used through the ages. There was an MGTC from the 40s, a Ford Anglia, a Black Maria, and a Jaguar XJ40 that took pride of place at the centre. To the right of the cabinet, fixed firmly to the wall, was a photograph of Woody shaking hands with Tony Blair. To the right of that was a photograph of his eldest son Patrick, in full dress uniform, right before he was deployed to Afghanistan. He had been clothed in the exact same uniform for his burial 15 months later. Woody ended the phone conversation and immediately picked up the stress ball from the edge of his desk. His right hand clenched and relaxed around the clump of putty. Kim realised he reached for it a lot when she was around. "What do we have so far?" "Very little, sir. We were just outlining the investigation when you summoned me." His knuckles whitened around the ball, but he ignored the dig. Her eyes wandered to the right of his ear, to his current project on the windowsill. It was a Rolls-Royce Phantom, and construction had not progressed in days. "You had a run-in with Detective Inspector Wharton, I hear?" So the jungle drums had already been busy. "We exchanged pleasantries over the body." There was something about the model that didn't look quite right. To her eye, the wheelbase looked much too long. He squeezed the ball harder. "His DCI has been in touch. A formal complaint against you has been lodged, and they want the case." Kim sighed. Couldn't the weasel fight his own battles? She fought the urge to reach across and pick up the Rolls-Royce to rectify the mistake, but she contained herself. She slid her eyes along and met the gaze of her commanding officer. "But they're not going to get it, are they, sir?" He held her gaze for a long minute. "No, Stone, they are not. However, a formal complaint does not look good on your file, and quite frankly, I'm getting a little bit tired of receiving them." He swapped the ball to his left hand. "So I'm curious to see who you're buddying up with on this one." Kim felt like a child being asked to choose a new best friend. Her last performance review had highlighted only one area of improvement, playing nice with others. "Do I get a choice? Who would you choose?" "Bryant." The ghost of a smile hovered around his lips. "Then yes, you get to choose." So there was no choice at all, she thought. Bryant provided damage limitation, and with the neighbouring force sniffing at her backside, Woody wasn't taking any chances. He wanted her in the care of a responsible adult. She had been on the cusp of offering her boss a little advice that would save him hours of dismantling the rear axle of the Rolls, but quickly changed her mind. "Anything else, sir?" Woody put the stress ball back and took off his glasses. "Keep me updated." "Of course." "Oh, and Stone." She turned at the door. "Let your team have some sleep now and again. They're not all charged via a USB port like you." Kim left his office, wondering how long it had taken Woody to come up with that little gem. Chapter 5. Kim followed Courtney, the school receptionist, through the hallways of St. Joseph's on their way to the office of the acting principal. From behind, Kim marvelled at the woman's ability to move so swiftly in 4-inch heels. Bryant sighed as they passed classroom after classroom. "Weren't these just the best days of your life?" "No." They turned into a long corridor on the 2nd floor and were led into an office with a discoloured oblong on the door, where the nameplate had already been taken off. The male behind the desk stood. His suit was expensive, and his tie was a sky-blue silky number. The flat black colour of his hair indicated it had been recently dyed. He offered his hand across the desk. Kim turned away, examining the contents of the walls. Any certificates or memorabilia containing the name of Teresa Wyatt had already been removed. Bryant accepted the extended hand. "Thank you for accommodating our requests, Mr. Whitehouse." "You're the deputy principal, I understand," Kim noted. He nodded and sat. "I will be stepping in as acting principal, and if I can be of any assistance in the investigation—" "Oh, I'm sure you will be," Kim interrupted. There was something disingenuous about his manner, too well rehearsed. The fact he had already moved into Teresa Wyatt's office and removed all traces of her existence was distasteful, to say the least. The woman had been dead for less than 12 hours. She guessed that his curriculum vitae had already been updated. "We'd like a list of all staff members. Please arrange for them to be available to speak with us in alphabetical order." The set of his jaw indicated that he didn't respond all that well to instruction. Kim briefly wondered if that was the case with all women, or just her. He lowered his eyes. "Of course, I'll have Courtney arrange that for you immediately. I've made available a room down the hall that will more than meet your needs to conduct the interviews." Kim looked around and shook her head. "No, I think we'll be just fine right here." His mouth opened to respond, but good manners prevented him laying total claim to the workspace so soon. Whitehouse gathered some belongings from the top of the desk and headed towards the door. "Courtney will be with you shortly." As the door closed behind the acting principal, Bryant chuckled. "What?" she said, taking the chair behind the desk. "Nothing, Gov." He moved one of the chairs to the side of the desk and sat down. Kim assessed the placement of the remaining chair for the interviewees. "Move that one back a little." Bryant moved the chair so that it was closer to the door. Adrift. There was nothing to lean on or sit against. Now she could observe the body language. A light knock sounded on the door. They both shouted, "Come in," at the same time. Courtney entered with a piece of paper and a smile that was trying to climb out of her mouth. So, Mr. Whitehouse was not all that popular. "Mr. Adlington is outside when you're ready," Kim nodded. "Please show him in. Can I get you anything else? Coffee, tea?" "You most certainly can. Coffee for both of us." Courtney headed to the door and reached it before Kim remembered. "Thanks, Courtney." Courtney nodded and held the door open for the first interviewee. Chapter 6. By 4:15 p.m., after 12 identical conversations, Kim's head hit the desk. There was something satisfying about the thunk of her skull on wood. "I know what you mean, Gov," Bryant offered. "Looks like we've got ourselves a real-life saint in the morgue." He took a pack of mentholyptus cough sweets from his pocket. By her count, that was his 5th. 2 years ago, a chest infection had prompted an instruction from the doctor to give up his habit of 30 cigarettes a day. In an effort to get rid of the ripping cough, Bryant had popped the sweets non-stop. The smoking had gone, but an addiction to the cough sweets had remained. "You really need to cut down on those, you know." "It's that kind of day, Gov." And like a seasoned smoker, he indulged more when stressed or bored. "Who's next?" Bryant consulted the list. "Joanna Wade, English language." In stepped a woman wearing tailored black trousers and a lilac silk shirt. Her long blonde hair was tied back in a ponytail, revealing a strong square jaw and little makeup. She sat without offering her hand and crossed her right ankle over the left. Her hands landed neatly in her lap. "We won't take up too much of your time, Mrs. Wade. We just need to ask you a few questions." "Ms." "Excuse me?" "It's Ms, Detective, not Mrs. But please call me Joanna." The voice was low and controlled, with a hint of a northern accent. "Thank you, Ms. Wade. How long have you known Principal Wyatt?" The teacher smiled. "I was employed by Principal Wyatt almost 3 years ago." "How was the working relationship between the two of you?" Miss Wade fixed her gaze on Kim and cocked her head slightly. "Really, Detective? No foreplay?" Kim ignored the innuendo and returned the gaze. "Please answer the question." "Of course. We had a reasonable working relationship, not without its ups and downs, which happens between most females, I find. Teresa was a very focused principal, rigid in her beliefs and convictions." "In what way?" "Methods of teaching have evolved since Teresa's time in the classroom. Creativity is often needed to instill knowledge into young, fertile minds. We have all tried to adapt to a changing culture, but Teresa believed that quiet, disciplined book learning was the only way to teach, and anyone who tried anything different was suitably advised. As Joanna Wade talked, Kim assessed her body language to be open and honest. She also noted that the woman had not glanced at Bryant once. "Can you give me an example?" "A couple of months ago, one of my students turned in a paper whereby half of the prose had been written in abbreviations, more commonly used to communicate by text message or on Facebook. I sent all 23 students to their lockers to retrieve their mobile phones. I then insisted that they spend the next 10 minutes texting each other in correct grammatical English, including appropriate punctuation. This process felt completely alien to them, and they all got the point, which was that the methods of communication don't translate. It hasn't happened since. And Teresa wasn't happy with this. Miss Wade shook her head. Not at all. She felt that the boy concerned should have been given detention, and that would have sent a clearer message. I dared to disagree, and Teresa made a note of insubordination on my file. "This isn't the picture we've been getting from other members of staff here, Miss Wade." The woman shrugged. "I can't speak for anyone else. However, I would say that there are teachers here who have given up. Their methods of reaching young minds no longer work, and they are treading water until retirement. They are content to remain uninspired and uninspiring. I, however, am not." Again her head cocked to one side, and a small smile tugged at her mouth. Teaching today's teenagers to appreciate the beauty and finesse of the English language is truly challenging, but I firmly believe that one should never shy away from a challenge. Don't you agree, Detective? Bryant coughed. Kim offered a small smile in return. The woman's confidence and open dialogue was a breath of fresh air after 12 identical responses. The blatant flirting was amusing. Kim sat back. "What can you tell me about Teresa the woman? Would you like me to toe the line and offer the politically correct epitaph reserved for the recently deceased, or should I be candid? Your honesty would be appreciated." Miss Wade recrossed her legs. As a school principal, Teresa was driven and focused. As a woman, I feel that she was quite a selfish person. As you will see from her desk, there are no pictures of anything or anyone important to her. She thought nothing of keeping staff members here until 8 or 9 o'clock. A great deal of her time was spent at spas, shopping for designer clothes and booking expensive holidays. Bryant made a couple of notes. "Is there anything else you feel might be of help to the investigation?" The woman shook her head. "Thank you for your time, Miss Wade." The woman sat forward. "If you'd like an alibi, Detective, I was at Liberty Gym practicing my yoga moves, excellent for muscle flexibility. And if you're interested, I'm there every Thursday night." Kim met her gaze. The clear blue eyes sparkled with challenge. She sauntered towards the desk and held out a business card. Kim had no choice but to hold out her hand. The woman placed the card in Kim's palm and turned the contact into a handshake. Her touch was cool and firm. Her fingers lingered over Kim's palm as the hand withdrew. "Here's my number. Please feel free to call if I can be of any further assistance." "Thank you, Miss Wade. You've been most helpful." "Jesus, Gov," Bryant said as the door closed. "You didn't need a book to read those signals." Kim shrugged. "You've either got it or you haven't." She placed the card into her jacket pocket. "Any more?" No, she was the last. They both stood. "That's it for today. Go home and get some rest," Kim said. She had a feeling they were going to need it. Chapter 7. "Okay, folks. Hope you all got some rest and kissed your loved ones goodbye." "Yeah, no social life for the foreseeable future," Dawson groaned. "So no change for Stacy, but the rest of us have real lives." Kim ignored him, for now. "The TUBs want this one solved by the end of the week." They all knew her acronym stood for Totally Unreasonable Brass. Substitution of the last word was optional, dependent on her mood. Dawson sighed. "What if our murderer didn't get the memo, Gov? he asked, checking his mobile phone. "Then come next Friday, I'll be arresting you, and trust me, I can make it stick." Dawson laughed. She remained serious. "Keep pissing me off, Kev, and it won't be a joke. Now, what did we get from the post-mortem?" He took out his notebook. "Lungs full of water, definitely drowned. 2 bruises just above her breasts. No sign of sexual assault, but difficult to tell. Anything else? Yep, she had chicken korma for dinner. Great, that'll break the case wide open." Dawson shrugged. "Not really much to come out of it, Gov. Bryant?" He moved a few pieces of paper, but Kim knew that any information was already in his head. "The area was canvassed again yesterday, but none of the neighbours saw or heard a thing. A couple of them knew her in passing, but it would appear she wasn't a coffee morning kind of person, not the most sociable of sorts." "Oh, well, there's a motive. Killed for her lack of community spirit." "Folks have been killed for less, Gov," Bryant responded, and she had to concede the point. 3 months earlier, they had investigated the murder of a male nurse who had been killed for 2 cans of beer and the loose change in his pocket. "Anything else?" Bryant picked up another piece of paper. "Nothing from forensics yet. Obviously no footprint evidence, and the fibre analysis has just started." Kim thought about Lacarde's exchange principle. It held the theory that the perpetrator of a crime will bring something to the scene and leave with something from it. It could be anything from a hair to a simple fibre. The art was in finding it, and with a crime scene trampled by 8 fire officers and a waterlogged bathroom, trace evidence was not going to raise its hand voluntarily. "Prints?" Bryant shook his head. "And we all know the murder weapon was a pair of hands, so we're unlikely to find them thrown in a bush somewhere." "You know, Gov, it ain't like this on CSI," Stacey offered. "Nothing on her phone either. All incoming and outgoing calls are either to St. Joseph's or local restaurants. Her contact list ain't all that long." "No friends or family at all?" "Certainly none she cared to keep in touch with. I've requested her home phone records and her laptop is on the way. Maybe there'll be something there." Kim grunted. "So basically 36 hours in and we've got absolutely bugger all. We know nothing about this woman." Bryant stood. "Give me just a minute, Gov," he said, and left the room. "OK, while Bryant powders his nose, let's recap." She looked to the board, which held barely more information than it had the day before. "We have a woman in her late 40s who was ambitious and hard-working. She was not particularly sociable or popular. She lived alone with no pets and no family connections. She was not involved in any dangerous activity and seems to have had no hobbies or interests whatsoever." "That may not be the case," Bryant said, taking his seat. "Apparently she was quite interested in an archaeological dig that's just been authorised to take place somewhere in Rowley Regis." "And you know this how?" "Just spoke to Courtney." "Courtney who?" "Courtney, who brought us coffee all day yesterday. I asked if our victim had spoken to anyone different during the last few weeks. Courtney had been asked to get a number for a Professor Milton at Worcester College." "I saw something on the local news about that," Stacey offered. "The professor's been trying to get permission to work on that site for ages. It's just a field since the old kids' home caught fire, but it's rumoured to hold buried coins. He's been fighting objections for about 2 years, but got the final go-ahead this week. It made the national news because of the long court battle." Finally, Kim felt the stirrings of excitement. Expressing interest in a local activity was hardly a smoking gun, but it was more than they had 10 minutes ago. "OK, you two carry on digging, excuse the pun. Bryant, go fire up the Batmobile." Dawson sighed heavily. Kim grabbed her jacket and paused at Dawson's desk. "Stace, don't you need the toilet right about now?" "No, Gov, I'm fine." "Stacey, leave the room." Tact and diplomacy had been invented by someone with too much time on their hands. "Kev, put your phone down a minute and listen. I know you're going through it a bit right now, but you really brought it on yourself. If you'd managed to keep your dick in your pants for another couple of weeks, you'd be in the loving embrace of your girlfriend and newborn daughter instead of back in your mum's spare room." Kim was not in the habit of employing sensitivity with her team members. She had enough trouble conjuring it for the general public. "It was a stupid drunken mistake at a stag party. Kev, no offence, that's your problem, not mine. But if you don't stop sulking like a little girl every time you don't get your own way, that desk over there will not be the only one going spare. Do we understand each other?" She gave him a hard stare. He swallowed and then nodded. Without another word, Kim left the room and headed down the stairs. Dawson was a gifted detective, but the line he was treading was a very thin one indeed. Chapter 8. For the second time in as many days, Kim walked amongst that air of naive expectation present at every learning facility. Bryant headed to the reception desk while she stood to the side. A group of males to her right were laughing at something on a mobile phone. One of the males turned to her. His gaze travelled the length of her body, pausing at her breasts. He tipped his head and smiled. She mirrored his actions and took in the skinny jeans, V-neck t-shirt and Justin Bieber hairstyle. She met his gaze and smiled in response. "Never gonna happen, sweet pea." He immediately turned back into the group, praying that his friends had not witnessed the exchange. "There's something not quite right here," Bryant said. "Receptionists look confused when I asked to see the professor. There's someone coming, but I don't think it's going to be him." Suddenly the groups began parting like the Red Sea, as a woman 4 feet in heels bustled through. Her form was small, but she travelled like a bullet, slowing for nothing. Her keen eyes searched the area and landed on the two of them. "Shit, hide," Bryant said, as she headed right for them. "Detectives?" she said, offering her hand. Kim's nose was assaulted by the aroma of apple blossom. Tight greying curls clung closely to her head, and her nose supported a pair of glasses that Dame Edna wanted back. Bryant shook the hand. Kim did not. "And you are?" "Mrs. Pearson, Professor Milton's assistant." OK, clearly the professor was too busy to see them. If they learned nothing from his assistant, they would be forced to insist. "May we ask you some questions about a project Professor Milton is working on?" Bryant asked. "Very quickly," she answered. There was no offer to go elsewhere to speak more privately. The woman was clearly going to give them only a little time. "The professor is interested in an archaeological dig." Mrs. Pearson nodded. "Yes, permission was granted a few days ago." "What exactly is he looking for?" Bryant asked. "Valuable coins, detective." Kim raised an eyebrow. "In a field on the outskirts of Rowley Regis?" Mrs. Pearson sighed as though speaking to an errant toddler. "You are clearly ignorant of the richness of our immediate locale. Have you never heard of the Staffordshire hoard?" Kim looked at Bryant. They both shook their heads. Mrs. Pearson made no attempt to hide her disdain. Clearly people outside of academia were Philistines. "One of the most substantial fields of our time was discovered in a field in Lichfield a few years ago. More than 3,500 pieces of gold valued at just over £3 million. Just recently, a hoard of silver denarius coins dating back to 31 BC were discovered in Stoke-on-Trent." Kim was intrigued. "Who gets the money?" "Well, take the recent find in Bredon Hill, Worcestershire. A man with a metal detector found Roman gold, including coins. Both he and the farmer received over £1.5 million. "What makes the professor think there's something in Rowley?" Mrs. Pearson shrugged. "Local legend, myth about a battle that took place in that area." "Did he recently take a call from a woman named Teresa Wyatt?" The woman thought for a moment. "Yes, I think so. She called a few times, insisting on speaking to Professor Milton. I think he called her back late one afternoon." OK, Kim had had enough. There was something here, and she was no longer content to speak to the monkey. She needed the organ grinder to recount the content of that conversation. "Thank you for your help, Mrs. Pearson, but I think regardless of how busy the professor might be, we need to speak to him immediately." Mrs. Pearson looked puzzled, then angry. "Now I have a question for you, detective. Don't you people talk to each other?" "Excuse me?" Bryant asked. "Well, you're obviously not from the missing persons unit, otherwise you'd know." "Know what, Mrs. Pearson?" She harumphed and crossed her arms across her chest. "That Professor Milton has not been seen or heard of for more than 48 hours. Chapter 9. Nicola Adamson closed her eyes against the foreboding that washed over her as she put the key into the lock of the penthouse apartment. Despite her gentle touch, the sound still seemed to reverberate around the hall, as did most things at 2:30 a.m. Myra Downs in apartment 4C would be out any second to see who was making all the noise. Nicola could swear the retired accountant slept against the front door. As expected, she heard the familiar sound of her neighbour's deadbolt sliding across the bottom of the door, but she managed to curl herself into her own apartment before the one-woman neighbourhood watch committee spotted her. Even before she hit the light switch, Nicola could feel the difference in her home. It had been taken over, invaded. Although the space was still hers, she was having to share it all, again. She removed her shoes and padded through the lounge quietly, headed for the kitchen. Despite the visitor in the spare room, she tried to maintain her own habits, her own routine, her own life. She took a lasagna from the fridge and placed it into the microwave. Work always made her hungry, and this was her routine. Get back from the club, warm up a meal while taking a shower, then a bite to eat with a glass of red wine before going to bed. Having to share her home was not going to change that. Nevertheless, she tiptoed across to the bathroom. She was tired and in no mood for drama. Once in the bathroom, Nicola breathed a sigh of relief. Each door she closed behind her was a battle fought and won. She pictured herself inside a computer game where the object was to clear each room whilst outrunning the enemy. That was unfair, she chided herself, as she dropped the clothes in a pile beside the walk-in shower. She had to adjust the temperature dial, which irritated her. Until a week ago, no adjustment had been necessary. The dial would have been right where she left it. She closed her eyes and lifted her face to meet the steaming water. The needles felt good on her skin. She turned away from the spray and craned her neck back. Within seconds, the power shower had soaked her long blonde hair. She reached behind to the metal rack, but found an empty space. Damn it, the bottle had been placed on the floor again. She reached down and picked it up. The force of the squeeze sent a stream of shampoo onto the shower glass. Again she swallowed down the irritation. Sharing her space shouldn't be so difficult, but it bloody well was. It was what she'd had to do all her life. She could feel the tension in her shoulders. Tonight had not been a good night for her. She'd worked at the Roxburgh for the 5 years since her 20th birthday and had loved every minute of it. She didn't care if people thought her job was seedy or degrading. She loved to dance, enjoyed showing off her body, and men paid a lot of money to watch her. She didn't strip, and there was no touching. It wasn't that kind of club. There were other clubs in the centre of Birmingham, and every dancer at every one of them aspired to work at the Roxburgh. For Nicola, it would be the only club at which she would ever work. She intended to retire from dancing when she reached 30 and pursue other interests. Her bank balance supported that plan. During the last 5 years, she had become the most popular dancer at the venue. She received on average 3 requests for private dances per night, and at £200 a time it was not to be sniffed at. She knew she was the Antichrist for some feminists, and to that she raised her middle finger. Women's liberation for her was about the right to choose, and she chose to dance, not because she was some vacant crackhead needing the money, but because she enjoyed it. Even as a child she had enjoyed performing. She had strived for that individuality, that uniqueness that would set her apart, that would make people notice her. But tonight she had felt dissatisfied with her performance. There had been no complaints from her customers. The Cristal had flowed, and 2 bottles of Dom Perignon had been bought by her last client, making her boss a very happy man. But Nicola knew. She knew that tonight her mind had not been fully on her work. She had not felt that total submission of herself, her mind and body to the performance. To her it was the difference between best actress or best support. She washed the conditioner from her hair and stepped out of the shower. She towelled herself dry and snuggled into the robe, enjoying the sensation of the warm fabric against her skin. She tied the belt around her waist and stepped out of the bathroom. She stopped dead. For a moment she had forgotten. Just for a moment. "Beth," she breathed. "Who else?" Nicola headed to the kitchen. "Sorry if I woke you," she said, removing the lasagna from the microwave. She took out 2 plates and halved the meal. She placed one plate at her own seat and the other opposite. "Aye, hungry," Beth said. Nicola tried not to cringe at Beth's broad black country dialect. It was a habit she herself had worked hard to overcome. As children they had both spoken that way, but Beth had made no effort to change. "Have you eaten today?" Nicola asked, and then silently reprimanded herself. Would she ever grow out of the habit of being the older twin, even if it was only a matter of minutes? "You don't want me here, do you?" Nicola stared down into the pasta. Suddenly her appetite was gone. The directness of her sister's question did not surprise her, and it was futile to lie. Beth knew her almost as well as she knew herself. "It's not that I don't want you here, it's just that it's been so long." "And whose fault's that, dear sister?" Nicola swallowed and took her plate to the sink. She dared not look. She could not face the accusation and hurt. "Do you have plans for tomorrow?" she asked, steering their conversation to something less explosive. "Of course. Will you be working again tomorrow night?" Nicola said nothing. It was obvious that Beth disapproved of her lifestyle. "Why do you degrade yourself like that?" "I enjoy what I do," Nicola defended. She hated that her voice had risen an octave. "But your degree's in sociology. It's a bloody waste." "At least I have a degree," Nicola shot back and instantly regretted it. The silence between them was charged. "Well, you took that dream away from me, didn't you?" Nicola knew that Beth blamed her for their estrangement, but she could never bring herself to ask why. Nicola stared into the sink, clutching the unit. "Why did you come back?" Beth sighed heavily. "Where else would I go?" Nicola silently nodded, and the air between them calmed. "It's all going to start back up again, ain't it?" Beth asked quietly. Nicola heard the vulnerability in her sister's voice, and it made her heart ache. Some bonds could not be broken. The dirty plate blurred before her eyes, and the years without her sister bore down on her. "And how will you protect me this time, big sis?" Nicola wiped at her eyes and turned, reaching out to hold her twin, but the bedroom door had already closed. Nicola emptied the contents of the second plate. She spoke quietly towards the spare bedroom. "Beth, for whatever reason you hate me, I'm sorry. So very, very sorry." Chapter 10. At 7 a.m, Kim stood before the headstone and pulled the leather jacket tightly around herself. On top of the rolly hill, dominated by Pauk Lane Cemetery, the wind howled around her. It was Saturday, and she always made time for family on a Saturday, new case or not. Grave markers still bore the debris of Christmas gifts left by the living guilty, wreaths reduced to skeletal twigs, poinsettias battered into wilted submission by the weather. A layer of frost glistened on top of the imperial red stone. From the moment she'd found the simple wooden cross marking the space, she had saved as much as she could from her 2 jobs and bought the stone. It had been installed 2 days after her 18th birthday. Kim gazed at the sparse gold lettering, all she'd been able to afford back then, a simple name and 2 dates. As usual, she was struck by the distance between the 2 years engraved, no more than a blink. She kissed her fingers and placed them firmly against the cold stone. "Good night, sweet Mikey. Sleep tight." The tears stung her eyes, but she fought them back. They were the same words she had spoken right before the last breath had left his fragile, defeated body. Kim put the memory safely back into the box and donned her helmet. She pushed the Kawasaki Ninja to the exit gate. There was something disrespectful about igniting the roar of the 1400cc engine within the confines of the cemetery. A metre out, and she spurred the machine into action. At the bottom of the hill, she pulled into an industrial estate, awash with to let signs, a stark testament to the area's industrial history, and a suitably barren area from which to make the phone call. Kim took out her phone. This was not a conversation that took place anywhere near Mikey's grave. She would not allow his final resting place to be contaminated by evil. She had to protect him, even now. The call was answered on the 3rd ring. "Nurse Taylor, please." The line went dead for a few seconds before she heard the familiar voice. "Hi, Lily, it's Kim Stone." The nurse's voice was warm. "Hi, Kim, it's lovely to hear from you. I thought you might call today." The nurse said the same thing every time, and yet it had never changed once. She'd made this call on the 12th of each month for the last 16 years. "How is she?" "She's had a quiet Christmas, but she seemed to enjoy the choir that visited." "Any violent episodes?" "No, not for a while now. Her medication is stable." "Anything else?" "She asked about you again yesterday. Although she has no concept of dates, it's almost like she knows when you're about to call." The nurse paused. "You know, if you ever wanted to come and—" "Thank you for your time, Lily." Kim had never visited and never would. Grantley Psychiatric Clinic had been home to her mother since Kim was 6 years old, and it was where she belonged. "I'll tell her you called." Kim thanked her again and hit the end button. The nurse treated Kim's monthly phone calls as a welfare check to see how her mother was doing, and Kim had never informed her otherwise. Only Kim knew that she made the call to ensure that the murdering evil bitch was still safely behind bars. Chapter 11. Righty, update folks. Kev, what do we know from Miss Purrs? Professor Milton has just divorced for the 3rd time. A bit like Simon Cowell, all his exes have nothing but good to say about him. No natural children of his own, but stepfather to 5, no hostility noted. When did he go missing? Wednesday was the last time he was seen. His assistant at the college raised the alarm when he didn't appear on Thursday morning. He hasn't been in touch with any of his family members, which is apparently very strange. Anything to suggest he's done this before? Dawson shook his head. To hear the exes talk, he's a reincarnation of Gandhi, mild-mannered and gentle. Kev consulted his notes. The latest ex spoke to him on Tuesday afternoon, and he was excited that he finally had permission for the dig. "I've been looking into that, Gov," Stacey offered. "The original application made by Professor Milton was 2 years ago. There have been more than 20 objections to the project, environmental, political, cultural. I ain't got anything further on that yet." "Keep trying, Stace. Bryant, do we know exactly when our victims spoke to the professor?" Bryant held out a piece of paper. "Courtney faxed me the telephone log. They spoke for 12 minutes on Wednesday at around 5:30. Kim crossed her arms. "OK, so all we have so far is that our victim had a brief conversation with a university professor on Wednesday afternoon, and now one of them is dead and the other is missing." A knock sounded on the door. A constable stood in the doorway. "What?" she barked. She hated interruptions during briefing. "Ma'am, I have a gentleman at the desk who wants to speak to you." Kim looked at him as though he'd lost his mind. "I know, ma'am, but he insists that he will only speak to you. He says he's a professor." Kim was out of her chair. "Bryant, with me," she said, stopping at the door. "Stace, find out whatever you can about this land." She headed out and took the stairs. Bryant almost kept pace with her. In the reception, she was greeted by a male with a full grey beard and a shock of wiry hair. "Professor Milton?" He stopped wringing his hands long enough to offer a handshake. Kim took his hand briefly and then gave it back to him. "Please, come this way." Kim guided him through the corridor to interview room 1. "Bryant, place a call to Miss Purse so they don't waste any more time. Is there anything we can get you?" "A sweet cup of tea." Bryant nodded and closed the door behind them. "A lot of people have been worried about you, Professor." She didn't intend for the words to sound like a rebuke, but she hated any waste of police time. Resources were scant enough. He nodded his understanding. "I'm sorry, Detective. I didn't know what to do. I only spoke to Mrs. Pearson a few hours ago and she told me about your visit. She said I could trust you." Kim was surprised that the old harridan had formed that opinion of her. "Where have you been?" she asked. It wasn't the question that rolled around in her mouth, but if Bryant had been beside her, he would have urged caution. The male was clearly trembling and his hands had returned like magnets to each other. "Barmouth, at a bed and breakfast. I just had to get away." "But on Wednesday you were over the moon, Mrs. Pearson told us." He nodded as Bryant entered the room. His hands held a triangle of styrofoam. He sat and pushed one of the cups towards the professor. Kim continued. "You spoke to a woman by the name of Teresa Wyatt on that day?" Professor Milton looked confused. "Yes, Mrs. Pearson mentioned that you had asked about that, but I'm not sure how it relates to what happened to me later." Kim had no idea what had happened to him later, but she did know that Teresa Wyatt had turned up dead. "Can you tell us why Teresa Wyatt called you?" "Of course. She asked if I would be accepting any volunteers onto the project." "What did you say?" He shook his head. "No, I only accept volunteers who have completed at least 1 year at university. Miss Wyatt expressed an interest in the subject of archaeology, but hadn't completed any study and certainly wouldn't have been able to before the project commenced at the end of February." Kim felt herself deflate. This was not a lead that would help them uncover a killer. It was a harmless conversation. "Was there anything else?" Bryant asked. The professor paused. "She did ask whereabout we would be commencing the dig, which I found a little strange in the context of the conversation." Yes, Kim thought, that was a little strange. "What happened later?" she asked, recalling his previous comment. Professor Milton swallowed. I got home from work, and Tess didn't greet me as she usually did. Kim looked at Bryant. Dawson said that the professor was single again. Ordinarily, she sleeps in the kitchen next to her water bowl, but as soon as I put my key into the lock, she's there, wagging her tail. Ah, that made more sense, Kim thought. But not Wednesday. I called her as I walked to the kitchen, but she didn't come. I found her next to her bed. He swallowed. She was convulsing on the floor. Her eyes were glassy and staring, and for a few seconds I didn't even see the note. I scooped her up and drove to the vet's as quickly as possible, but it was too late. She'd gone by the time I got there. He wiped his right eye. Kim opened her mouth to ask about the note, but Bryant cut her off. So sorry to hear that, Professor. Had she been unwell? Professor Milton shook his head. Not at all. She was only 4 years old. The vet didn't need to examine her. He could smell the antifreeze on her breath. Apparently dogs love it because it tastes sweet. The chemical had been poured into her water dish and she'd drunk the lot. You said there was a note? Bryant prompted gently. His eyes reddened. Yes, the bastard stapled it to her ear. Kim winced. Do you recall what it said? He reached into his jacket. I have it here. The vet removed it afterwards. Kim took the note. Forensically, it would be of no use now. The professor had handled it, and so had the vet. She unfolded it and laid it out on the table. It was simple black type on white paper and read, Kill the dig or wife number 3 will be next. I didn't even go back home. I'm ashamed to admit that I was terrified and still am. Who would do this, detective? The professor drained the last of his tea. I don't even know where I can go. Mrs. Pearson, Kim offered. She'd seen the expression on the woman's face when she'd spoken of the professor. That little bulldog wouldn't let anyone near him. Kim stood and took the note, while Bryant shook the man's hand and offered to get him a ride to wherever he wanted to go. Kim clutched the note and headed back to the office. She couldn't help feel that somewhere out there was one humongous can of worms, and that she'd just been handed the can opener. OK, Kev, I think we're going to need fresh coffee. Stace, what did you find out about that land? It's about 1 acre in size and sits right next to the Rowley crematorium. It's at the tip of a council estate built in the mid-50s. Before the housing development, it was the site of a steelwork factory. Bryant entered the room on his mobile phone. Thank you, Courtney. You've been a wonderful help. What? Bryant asked, as 6 curious eyes landed on him. Courtney, Kim asked, is there something I need to drop to your wife? Bryant chuckled as he removed his suit jacket. I'm a happily married man, Gov. My wife said so. And anyway, Courtney is mending a broken heart courtesy of Joanna, the English teacher that was coming on to you the other day. Dawson turned, his eyes wide. Really, Gov? Down, boy. She turned to Bryant. Why the call? Bryant raised an eyebrow. Following your logic of past, present and future, I asked Courtney if she had access to Teresa Wyatt's employment history. She's faxing it over. Put that girl on the Christmas list. She's saving us a fortune in warrants. Kim turned back to Stacey, trying to visualise the piece of land. Hang on. Are you talking about that field right next to the crematorium? The one where the travelling fair sets up? Stacey turned her monitor and pointed. An image from Google Earth filled the screen. Look, there's something fenced off at the road edge, but otherwise it's just a waste piece of land. Kim's gut was now churning out of control. Every sense she possessed was on high alert. Stace, look up the name Crestwood and get me everything you can. I have some calls to make. Kim took a breath as she sat at her own desk. A few pieces of the puzzle began to slide into place, and for the first time in her life, she hoped she was wrong.